Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Fandom and the Beatles, the act you've known for all these years, by Kenneth Womack and Kit O'Toole. Narrated by Michael Butler Murray and Emily Sutton-Smith. Preface. Mark Lapidus. Believe it or not, the idea behind the longest-running Beatles festival began in, of all places, an ice cream parlor. It was a Saturday night, mid-November, 1973, on the Upper East Side of New York City. Realizing that it was only a few short months until the 10th anniversary of the Beatles' legendary performance on The Ed Sullivan Show in February 1964, I felt that somebody ought to do something about it. As I contemplated a dish of vanilla ice cream, the word Beatlefest popped into my head. I knew that an event of that kind should be in a big midtown hotel, with scads of Beatles-related events and fan-based activities. The idea seemed so all-consuming that I didn't breathe a word about it for 6 weeks, when I finally broke down and shared the concept for a Beatlefest with a few friends and family members. Shortly after New Year's Day, I decided that it was time to proceed. Unfazed, I booked the weekend of September 7th to 8th, 1974. While I knew that the time was right for a Beatles convention, I didn't feel it was right to make the festival a reality without the band members' support. In those days, the Fabs had gone solo. That is, when they weren't suing each other to dissolve their partnership. Unfazed, I booked the first weekend of September 1974 at the old Commodore Hotel on East 42nd Street. I was so confident that I paid a non-refundable deposit with my own money. But that turned out to be the easy part. At that point, I painstakingly sent a letter with an accompanying cassette recording to each Beatle, in which I shared with them my idea and asked for permission to hold the festival. Not surprisingly, I didn't receive a response back from any of them. But still, I wasn't discouraged. After all, I was young and determined to bring my dream to fruition. Undaunted, I placed an ad in a February issue of The Village Voice. The 2-line, $14 notice read, Beatlefest. Anyone interested? Along with my address. Within a few days, I received some 400 letters from fans in all walks of life. But they all had one thing in common. They were excited to be a part of a Beatles-themed celebration. My biggest break yet came on Friday, April 26th, when I heard a commercial on WABC radio. Legendary DJ Cousin Brucey announced that John Lennon and Harry Nilsson were going to be appearing at a March of Dimes event in the city on that very weekend. The Fifth Dimension was the musical headliner, and with the likes of Lennon in town, the event was sure to be packed. That Sunday was an unusually warm late April day, so I wore my brand-new Beatles 10th anniversary T-shirt, courtesy of Capitol Records. At the time, I worked as a manager for Sam Goody, the largest record chain in the country, and I outfitted my entire staff at the chain's Radio City location with the commemorative shirts that were exclusive to only my store, to mark the occasion. When I arrived at Central Park that day, the lawn was already teeming with more than 100,000 fans, many of whom were there to catch a glimpse of Lennon. As I scanned the crowd, I noticed a guy wearing the same 10th anniversary shirt that I had on. Making my way through the throng, I asked him how he'd gotten his hands on such a hot new item. He told me that he had been driving his pickup truck through Times Square the night before, when he happened upon 2 inebriated fellows sitting on the curb on 42nd Street. When he got out of his truck, he discovered that they were none other than John Lennon and Harry Nilsson. He offered to give them a lift, and they directed him to the Pierre Hotel over on Fifth Avenue, just across the street from Central Park. When he dropped the musicians off, Lennon invited him up to their suite, where he rewarded the guy with an autograph and one of the commemorative shirts. Without missing a beat, the guy volunteered Lennon's room number. I simply couldn't believe it. 100,000 fans overrunning the park, and I happened upon the one person who knew where Lennon was staying that weekend. And all because of that shirt. My mission was suddenly clear. Biding my time, I caught Lennon, Nielsen, and Cousin Brucey's stage banter that afternoon, listening intently as they shared the good news about the March of Dimes and answered questions. With that, they left the stage and made their way out of the park. And so did I. Nonchalantly strolling over to the Pierre, I sat on a bench in the lobby just long enough to gather my nerves and confidence. After taking the elevator up to their floor, I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. Nielsen answered a few moments later, and I told him, "I'm Mark Lapidus, and I would like to speak to John about Beatlefest." Nielsen showed me into the parlor, and in short order, Lennon came out, and we shook hands. Sitting down in the hotel suite, I told him about my idea for a convention for Beatles fans. To mark the 10th anniversary, we would watch the Fabs films, enjoy presentations by special guests and music experts, listen to live music, and buy and sell Beatles items. It would be something for everyone. Lennon gushed with excitement about the idea, exclaiming, "I'm all for it. I'm a Beatles fan, too." I simply could not believe my good fortune. Not missing a beat, I asked Lennon to choose a charity for a raffle of special Beatles items. He picked the Phoenix House Foundation, a New York City drug rehabilitation center. He even offered up an old guitar that he would sign and donate for the raffle. Before I left, he signed a piece of paper to mark his support for the festival and asked me to return a few days later to work out the details. Etched in my mind, to this very day, the entire visit had taken no more than 20 minutes. But the repercussions from that afternoon at the Pierre proved to be a seismic moment. Suddenly, with Lennon's explicit encouragement, everything had changed. More than 7,000 fans attended the inaugural fest that September. The convention made the cover of Rolling Stone on October 24th, 1974. And 46 years and 135 national fests later, it is still going strong. When I look back on the fest now, I realize that we've created something lasting and special. An event that celebrates the Beatles' timeless music and, year after year, draws new folks into their incredible, affirmative, and life-changing story. As no less than Paul McCartney once said, "The Beatles' songs aspire to a greater good, daring the world to embrace love, peace, and understanding. It's all you need is love, or John's Give Peace a Chance," McCartney said. There was a good spirit behind it all, which I'm very proud of. But just as important, I have come to understand the fest's vital role in celebrating the idea of being a fan. After all, the fest, from its humble beginnings, was created by fans, for fans. Over the years, we've not only elevated the fan experience, but the fest has acted as the birthplace for an evolving knowledge base associated with the Beatles. From that very first event, back in September 1974, we have featured a parade of musicians and insiders that has included the likes of Mal Evans, Klaus Voormann, Mike McCartney, Cynthia Lennon, Pattie Boyd, Billy Preston, Donovan, Jerry Marsden, Billy J. Kramer, Astrid Kircher, Ronnie Spector, and Peter and Gordon, to name just a few. And the result has been, conservatively, the publication of several thousand works devoted to understanding the Beatles' indelible impact on musical culture and history. I am especially proud that the Fest has provided Beatles scholars with an ongoing event, held in different cities around the country, devoted to in-depth discussion about the Fabs and their unforgettable music. The Fest has provided myself and my family with a front-row seat as we watched successive generations of fans share their love for the Beatles. The book that you're holding in your hands documents fan culture as it relates to the act you've known for all these years. And I'm humbled to think that my dream, hatched over a bowl of ice cream nearly 50 years ago, has played a part in making this kind of work possible.
Introduction. The Act You've Known for All These Years. Kit O'Toole and Kenneth Womack. One of John Lennon's most beloved compositions in my life both reflects and projects visiting nostalgia but looking to the future. The narrator states that he will never lose affection for events and loved ones from his past, but their connotations change when I think of love as something new. Here, nostalgia transforms meaning when applied to present events. The person's memories are not erased, but are altered and perhaps given new meaning, depending on the person's current position in life. The same can be said for fandom of any type, be it film, television, or music. Nostalgia is largely malleable, changing with future generations' experience and ever-evolving technology. The Beatles fan community is no exception. First-generation fans to millennials and beyond have expressed their devotion to their favorite band in different ways, contributing new knowledge and even creating new products that translate the band's lasting impact to the present. Fandom and the Beatles, the act you've known for all these years, defines and explores fan response and the band's enduring appeal. The chapters in this volume study these unique qualities and the key ways in which this particular pop fusion has inspired such loyalty and multi-generational popularity. Fandom and the Beatles also explores the ways in which technology has shaped the band's legacy, introducing new listeners to its music through streaming services such as Spotify, Apple Music, and Tidal, and documentaries such as 2016's hugely successful Ron Howard film, The Beatles, 8 Days a Week, The Touring Years. The band's enduring images and style, its musical skills and songwriting craftsmanship, the proliferation of Beatles look-alike and tribute bands, and the ways in which the group continues to impact our thinking about gender and sexuality all contribute to answering one question. Why does this band inspire such particular devotion? Before exploring the topic, a brief overview of fan studies places this text in the context of previous work. Fan Studies Overview. Fan studies has grown along with fandom itself, particularly in defining the term fandom. The term eludes easy categorization, as it encapsulates several behaviors. Mark Duffett argues that key elements of music fandom have remained consistent: a fascination with music, various romantic and folk ideologies, an emphasis on the star system, a tendency of fans to form social communities, to pursue shared concerns, and to follow characteristic practices. Daniel Cavici proposes a description that may best summarize the various qualities one engages in to be considered a fan. Fandom is more of a process of distinction in which a fan must constantly question and monitor his or her experience, background, attitudes, and behaviors relative to all the other people involved in any rock audience. Ultimately, he concludes, the definition resides in the tension between all of those relationships at any given moment. That is why fandom is so difficult to grasp. It is also why fandom is so central to understanding popular music. As Henry Jenkins notes in his article, Fan Studies, the history of fandom research has transformed from general to specific, defining fandom as its own culture. Jenkins defines fans as individuals who maintain a passionate connection to popular media, assert their identity through their engagement with and mastery over its contents, and experience social affiliation around shared tastes and preferences. Thus, fan cultures provide social and cultural infrastructures that support fan activities and interests. In Jenkins's Textual Poachers, he described the activities of Star Trek fans, primarily female, analyzing how they continued the show's legacy through writing their own stories. Previous methods, such as the Birmingham cultural tradition, looked at larger effects on audiences. But today, research further explores fans who have self-identified as fans of a particular television show, film, musician, game, or other media. In addition, studies have transformed fan research from fan reception to what Jenkins terms fan cultural production, a particularly important subject considering the emergence of digital technologies. Fans are no longer passive receptacles of an artist's product. Rather, they create their own product, inspired by the original source, whether it be art, fan fiction, podcasting, or other forms. Richard Mills addresses these issues in The Beatles and Fandom, Sex, Death, and Progressive Nostalgia. The term progressive nostalgia summarizes the organization of this book, as it encompasses past, present, and future expressions of fandom. It can be argued that rock music itself demands more participation than previous genres. According to Stephen D. Stark, due to the post-World War II baby boom, the percentage of young people in the culture was near a historical high. In turn, youth had formed their own subculture, and at the heart of that rebellious enclave was rock and roll music. In sum, rock music defined what it meant to be a teenager. Fandom is, of course, nothing new. Before the Beatles, other idols inciting hysteria included Benny Goodman, Frank Sinatra, and Elvis Presley. Previous fan manias: Goodman, Sinatra, and Presley. On March 3, 1937, Goodman played what he and his band assumed would be a typical gig at New York's Paramount Theater. To their surprise, more than 12,000 fans crammed into the venue. By the time they concluded the set with Sing, 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 the young audience had spilled into the aisles, onto the stage, anywhere they could find to dance and express their joy. The clapping, whistling, and stomping astounded Goodman, with the ecstatic audience reaction signaling two changes: the rise in swing music and the then unprecedented, uninhibited fan response. Instead of being just another gig, the concert transitioned into a kind of celebration of the spirit, a love fest of communal frenzy. 7 years later, a similar event occurred in, coincidentally, the Paramount Theater. Beginning at 3 a.m., teenage girls lined up at the box office to see their idol, Sinatra. More than 30,000 people gathered outside the theater, hoping to score tickets. Women swooned, overwhelming police officers and shocking adults with their seemingly insane behavior. Who could have predicted that a throng of girls would smash windows, trample passers-by, and even, according to one report, overturn a car? These young female fans, often called Bobby Soxers, previewed fan hysteria to come. In 1956, a new idol with considerable sex appeal emerged: Presley. His swagger and slightly dangerous image both enthralled teenagers and shocked older generations, although his first appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show on September 6th attracted more than 60 million viewers. In later appearances, Sullivan famously only showed Presley from the waist up due to the singer's supposedly lewd gyrations. Despite these efforts, the screaming of excited teenage girls could not be drowned out. By the early 1960s, Presley had shifted his focus to film, unintentionally creating an opportunity for another act to capture fans' excitement and devotion. First in Britain, and then in Canada, the United States, and numerous other countries, the Beatles inspired unprecedented hysteria wherever they went. Unlike the fan adulation experienced by Presley, Sinatra, and Goodman, the Beatlemania phenomenon signaled a larger cultural shift. As Barbara Ehrenreich, Elizabeth Hess, and Gloria Jacobs state in their seminal work, Beatlemania, Girls Just Want to Have Fun, Beatlemania was the first mass outburst of the 60s to feature women, in this case girls, who would not reach full adulthood until the 70s, and the emergence of a genuinely political movement for women's liberation. Beatles Fandom History, First Generation. What distinguished Presley and the Beatles from previous idols was not only musical genre, but also attitude. As Ehrenreich argues in her essay Thawing Out in Penelope Rowlands's The Beatles Are Here, 50 years after the band arrived in America, writers, musicians, and other fans remember. One word personified pre-rock teenage culture: cool, meaning a kind of aloofness, emotional affectlessness, and a sense of superiority. In contrast, rock music demanded immediate and unguarded physical participation, thawed out the coolness, summoned the body into action, and blasted the mind out of the isolation and guardedness that had come to define the Western personality. Indeed, this new participation immediately surfaced upon the Beatles' arrival in both the United Kingdom and the United States. When the Beatles first landed on American shores in February 1964, teenagers across the country instantly reacted with great emotion and unprecedented hysteria. While this behavior may have bewildered parents in the States, British families had already been affected by this new phenomenon: Beatlemania. The Beatles would go on to become one of the most critically and commercially successful bands of all time, a symbol of the 1960s and its rapidly changing cultural and political landscape. John Munsey posits that the Beatles' greatest contribution to youth culture may have been Beatlemania itself, as, of all the social movements and cultural symbols of the 1960s, it was, at least, something that they could genuinely claim to be their own. Screaming fans not only reacted to the music, they became part of it, participants, particularly during concerts. As critic Geoffrey O'Brien writes in his memoir, Sonata for Jukebox, Pop Music, Memory, and the Imagined Life, to become involved with the Beatles, even as a fan among millions of others, carried with it the possibility of meddling with ferocious energies. Spectatorship here became participation. There were no longer to be any bystanders, only sharers. Mark Kirkup posits that the Beatles created the first modern pop mass fan base, with the full power of the press, the record industry, television, and radio. Even non-fans knew them, their story, and their music, and the force of that fandom even had a name, Beatlemania, that likened it to a disorder. In the 1960s, not all critics found this new fandom beneficial. In the February 28, 1964 edition of New Statesman, Paul Johnson laments the chaotic experience of a Beatles concert. The teenager comes not to hear, but to participate in a ritual, a collective groveling to gods who are themselves blind and empty. Here indeed is a new cultural movement, music which not only cannot be heard, but does not need to be heard. In Beatlemania, Ehrenreich, Hess, and Jacobs argue that the band also introduced a new era not only for teenage girls, but for teenagers in general. Departing from the conservative 1950s, the 1960s ushered in new mores considering sexuality and gender roles. The Beatles helped define this era, encouraging women to express their sexual selves more openly. However, their notion of marketing applies to both sexes, in that rock music has recognized how adolescent fans identify themselves as teenagers. Rather than just being a phase on the journey to adulthood, it was a status to be proud of, emotionally and sexually complete unto itself. Rock and roll was the most potent commodity to enter the teen consumer subculture. As Beatle fan executive editor Al Sussman recalls in his essay, The Communal Sgt. Pepper, 1967 teenage fans did not possess the tools present today for instant communication. The rock press was just emerging, and only small local fan clubs, consisting chiefly of women, existed. The release of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, however, bonded Beatles fans in a new way. That weekend became a very communal experience for Beatles fans of all ages throughout the world. Getting to know this monumental, groundbreaking record and the package around it was somehow different than the introductory process for any previous Beatles album. And I, like millions of others, knew I was not alone, Sussman writes. Another way first-generation fans networked was through Beatles Monthly, the official fan club publication. While it began as a channel for the group to communicate with fans as an informational service, readers ultimately played a greater part in the magazine. As Kirkup explains, it soon transformed into the voice of the fans themselves. Fans' opinions are the dominant feature of the original Beatles Monthly, with their delight, their fears, their humor, their obsessions, and their fanaticism. Overall, Kirkup concludes, in the current mass media landscape, audiences are saturated by every latest popular group, sound, dance routine, TV show, film franchise, not only by the traditional media channels, but through media actually produced and distributed by fans themselves. Even after the Beatles' 1970 breakup, fans clearly feel a special connection to the group. As fan Art Murray told Gary Berman for Berman's book We're Going to See the Beatles, an oral history of Beatlemania as told by fans who were there. For me, the Beatles represented the true vanguard. What they did was more than just a musical statement. It had a lot to do with how you visualized how you were going to look, what you were going to do, what you're gonna think. For me, and for a lot of people like me, the Beatles represented models of a sort. Fandom legacy. While enduring acts such as Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen, and the Rolling Stones have retained fans, they have not inspired the same fan expression. Their concerts continue to sell out, and dedicated Facebook groups allow fellow enthusiasts to network. Yet the Beatles' popularity has endured through international fan conventions, numerous tribute bands, and theatrical productions. Beatles courses have proliferated on college campuses, and new products such as box sets and even Beatles-themed movies such as Yesterday have racked up impressive sales. An April 2020 YouTube sing-along screening of Yellow Submarine drew more than 70,000 viewers from around the world. In We're Going to See the Beatles, Berman interviewed first-generation fans about how the Beatles impact their lives up to the present day. One interviewee, Paul Chasman, explained how the Beatles' influence extended beyond music. What I think maybe was the most significant to me about the Beatles was how much they grew, and how much they always challenged the boundaries, and never seemed to be satisfied with where they were. They were always trying to grow and do something interesting and creative and exciting. To me, that was one of the most important models I had for how I wanted to live my life. Fan Carol Cox adds that in the 1960s, the Beatles influenced every single thing that was going on at that point, especially if you were young. They influenced our way of thinking, the clothing they were wearing. Guys grew their hair. You couldn't live through that era without being influenced by the Beatles, and whether you realized it or not, you were influenced by the Beatles. The Beatles are a part of me, and that's something that will always be. Through her study of first-generation fans, Beatleness, Candy Leonard concluded that they continue to find meaning in the Beatles' music. Fans continue, approaching it with more life experience, wisdom, and maturity as they've grown older. But because the Beatles have been so internalized, bringing them to mind or listening to their music doesn't necessarily recall the past. Rather, fans have carried the Beatles with them into the present. More than 50 years later, the Beatles are still attracting fans from various generations, all while retaining their original fan base from the 1960s. Why have those first-generation fans continued following the Beatles? And why are they now introducing their grandchildren to the group?
Sample complete. Ready to continue?